Let's look at this story in a little more detail and the other big stories of the day. Annabel Denham is Deputy Comment Editor over there at the Telegraph. Afternoon to you, Annabel.
Good afternoon, Ian.
Nice to have you with us. I mean, it's a murky old story. Have I got it wrong here? I mean, it looks to me like a, bit of an oddball. Political parties find them all the time, whether they're candidates, whether they're campaigners. The Tories had a couple of people that were putting on bets about dates of election. We've seen anti-Semitism in the Labour Party, a little bit of racism here coming from a campaigner for reform. You find them and you kick them out. I would have thought that, and which is what Reform have done previously, it should be said, with undesirables. Does this have to go any deeper than that?
I think given the facts that we have at present, Ian, your analysis is very fair. Much as Reform representatives and those who have sought to defend them are trying to suggest that this story is murkier than it first appears, I think that Nigel Farage's initial response of condemning the remarks, as well he should have done in no uncertain terms, pointing out how vile and offensive they were, and in dismissing the activists involved from the party, ensuring that they're not going out and door knocking, not campaigning for reform, was the right move.
Correct.
Fear for Farage and for reform is that in attempting to suggest that there is some kind of conspiracy underway, they are giving this story, very unfavourable for reform story, more oxygen. And, I also think that it's playing into people's worst suspicions and the left's criticisms of any party or any politician who casts, some doubt over whether the current levels of immigration are feasible, or whether we really need to be taking a tougher stance on it to ensure that our public services, for instance, are not being overwhelmed, to ensure that we're giving immigrants who come here adequate time to fully integrate into British culture and British life. And I worry that that is being undermined by not just the actions of those individual campaigners, and as you say, to what extent is the party itself responsible for their actions, but also the way in which Reform are now, on social media, on the media, responding to this story.
I wonder, though, it seems to just looking at, and I shouldn't, I've done this job for a long time, Annabel, and I should never be surprised by this kind of reaction that happens. But for some reason, I came on, I made all the positive comments about Reform winkling people out. I made all the comments that this does not represent anywhere near the average person who represents Reform. David Bull, and, I can't tell you how many people I know really very, very well in Reform, including the chairman and the leader of the party. So, I'm hardly somebody who's sitting on the sidelines here, having a cheap snipe at my enemies. But nonetheless, even though I caveated everything with all of that, the fact that I refused to engage in the sort of Trump-esque sort of mainstream media hatchet job line has somehow rendered me about as left-wing and as dodgy as Jeremy Corbyn in the minds of some people. How does that work, by the way? One person did actually call me a Tory, which was a welcome relief, frankly, from being called a communist.
Well, I suspect that perhaps they're trying to play the man, not the ball there, Ian. It doesn't sound like a very fair representation of the position that you're putting forward. And, as you said in your introduction, there are all sorts of follow-up questions to some of the claims, the allegations that Reform are making here. Why would Channel 4 take on that enormous reputational risk of paying an extra actor to pretend to masquerade as a Reform activist and to make racist comments on camera? And why, indeed, would the actor himself agree to this unless he was doing so under some sort of false pretense or illusion?
And using his real name as well, which is extraordinary.
It is, exactly. It's very difficult to believe, at least at this stage, until we get further information. And again, we talked about Reform just giving this story more and more attention and allowing it to rumble on longer than it needs to. Well, I think efforts to denounce those who are really pushing forward vote a sensible, rational position. Criticising them is not going to help matters either.
Indeed. Let's move on to Keir's supermajority story. A terrifying Labour supermajority could be averted, according to a major poll of undecided voters. 1 in 10, amounting to more than 4 million ballots, are unsure about who to back, giving the Tories a little bit of hope of avoiding a wipeout. This is against what, of course, much of the polling is suggesting at the moment, and that is that Starmer is coming in with a minimum of 200 MPs, 200 majority, and that would be extraordinary.
It would be extraordinary, and this is a long-running story of this seemingly interminable general election campaign, that actually there are so many undecided voters out there in Britain today, people who are not necessarily torn between voting for Starmer or voting for Rishi Sunak because they're both such inspiring candidates but rather they can barely bring themselves to get to the polling station on July the 4th to vote for them because they just don't feel encouraged in any way to do so. And, it was Grant Shapps who a couple of weeks ago started to talk about Labour getting a supermajority. Perhaps that was a scare tactic to encourage traditional Tory voters who feel very disillusioned, disenchanted, who feel quite betrayed by the Tories and their failure to deliver on some of their manifesto promises, trying to get them to get out and vote. But nonetheless, it is at the same time fed this idea that actually Keir Starmer is going to have a landslide victory, much greater even than that in 1997 that Tony Blair was able to secure. Perhaps this will inject some enthusiasm and excitement into a Tory campaign that has been lacklustre and suffered various gaffes. And it's coming after Rishi Sunak's performance on Wednesday in that BBC leaders debate, where I thought he did very well. I thought, even though the YouGov poll after put them neck and neck, I thought that he performed better than Keir Starmer. He had him on the ropes in certain areas, and he was able to really get some points across. So perhaps that will move the dial in the last week of the election campaign, but I think ultimately it's unlikely. It does now look like a foregone conclusion, despite this polling today and despite the fact that there's a bit more energy coming from Rishi Sunak and the campaign.
Well, there certainly was on that last TV debate. It was the most animated we had seen Sunak in the entire campaign, and I think that maybe played rather well for him. But those untapped votes, I've never known, Annabel, and maybe you know more about this, but when the YouGovs and the like go out to interview people, do they factor in the undecideds in some way to still belch out this, what is at the moment an extraordinarily advantageous position for Keir Starmer? Are the 4 million, as it might be, undecideds sort of baked into that equation when they poll?
It depends on the polling company and how they're going about it. So some will simply ask which party they're going to vote for, and they'll set aside the undecideds, and others will include that polling data as well. So it's just on a poll by poll basis. Of course, it's important really to know how many people out there still don't know who they're going to throw their support behind. And, it has been clear that there is little love for Keir Starmer and for the Labour Party, because ultimately, what is there to love, really? Higher taxes, a capitulation to woke progressives on every imaginable cause, a Race Equality Act, which the Equalities Minister, Kevin Badenoch, today was highly critical of, a government that may still just struggle to define what a woman is, closer alignment with the European Union, which Keir Starmer seems to believe he's going to achieve without needing to make any trade-offs, without needing to capitulate or surrender anything in return. And what's extraordinary, of course, about the Labour supermajority is that Keir Starmer could end up with over 500 seats on around 38% of the vote, but that's our first past the post electoral system, and that's reflective of the way in which the right has been split between the Conservatives.
Which is extraordinary. So you've done nothing special. You've announced no amazing policy. You aren't personally loved, not even in the way that Tony Blair might have. You looked at Tony Blair and thought, well, this is a guy with a philosophy. Don't always agree with him, but he's got an idea. He's got a game plan. It's he's moving his party. He's reflecting contemporary times, etc. There's none of that going on, and yet he's likely to become the most successful Prime Minister in history based on numbers of MPs.
Well, I think that that's just a damning indictment of 14 years of Conservative government. It's very difficult for them to point to any area of policy and convince voters that the situation has improved, education being the only notable exception to that. And what was interesting in that debate on Wednesday really was how much Rishi Sunak was attempting to look forward and trying to force out of Keir Starmer some detail on the promises that he's making, because so much of it seems to be hot air. Everything will be better and people's lives are going to improve and there'll be better public services and more houses, but actually so thin on details, really lacking meat on the bone. Whereas Keir Starmer, you want to press Rishi Sunak on the Conservative past. And I'm not sure voters were really any the wiser as to what a Starmer administration is going to look like. Really, we've got to go on the pledges that he made when he became Labour leader, which were further to the left than he is now. Perhaps his background, some of the contributions that he'd made to various magazines when he was in his late 20s. The fact that actually during this election campaign, he reiterated that he was indeed a socialist. So I suspect one of two things is happening, Ian. Either he is actually much further to the left than he says he is, and he's concealing it from the British public, or he has genuinely moved to the centre. But in that case, are we just going to have more managed decline? Are we going to have what we've essentially had over the last 5 years, but under different colours?
There it is. We'll watch with interest. Annabel, always great to get your views on these things. Annabel Denham is Deputy Comments Editor over there at The Telegraph.